Hi again. It's Russ Barkley here with another commentary on topics in the news related to ADHD. This time we're going to talk about the link of ADHD to claims of greater entrepreneurship. As you see here, we've got a PowerPoint presentation, so let's just open this up and get it started. And this claim is ubiquitous in the trade literature on the benefits of having adult ADHD specifically. So we've talked before about other attributes that have been either complex or disproven, such as those of ADHD related to IQ or giftedness, those of ADHD related to creativity, a more complex relationship, and now we'll examine whether ADHD is related to a greater likelihood of being a successful entrepreneur. As always, the devil is in the details, and it really depends on how you want to define being an entrepreneur. The dictionary, such as Merriam-Webster's, defines an entrepreneur as a person who simply organizes and operates a business or businesses in which they are taking on greater than normal financial risks in doing so. In short, they're self-employed. So that would include anybody from landscapers to people who cut yards for a living to people who are in the trades or other activities in which they are self-employed. They generate the business themselves and they're in charge of the business. So if that's what you mean by being an entrepreneur, well, we're going to see that there is some evidence suggesting that people with ADHD may be more likely to be self-employed, particularly by midlife. But we're also going to examine whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or both. So we'll have a look at that later. But if you speak to people in the business community who are studying ADHD or those in academia in business schools who are studying entrepreneurship, you'll find that their definition of being an entrepreneur goes well beyond this dictionary view of entrepreneurs being simply self-employed individuals. For instance, Investopia has a article in which they define an entrepreneur is an individual who creates a new business, bears most of the risks, and enjoys most of the rewards. It's the process of setting up the business. So specifically, this is a person who undertakes the risk of starting that new venture. So starting a new venture as an entrepreneur. Again, kind of like being self-employed, but there's a little more implied here that has to do with innovation, perhaps creativity. The entrepreneur creates a firm to realize their idea. That's also being part of an entrepreneur. And they aggregate the capital needed, that is, bring together the money and other resources and the labor in order to produce the goods or the services for profit that were generated by their own idea. Again, a little bit broader view of being an entrepreneur than straight self-employment. The entrepreneur is assuming high risk. It's a highly risky venture, and it often offers high rewards. And it serves to generate economic wealth, growth, and innovation. Boy, now we really are getting into a broader view of being an entrepreneur. But to many, of course, it's just being self-employed. However, when we look at the business school literature, such as here, that of Kelsey Miller at the Harvard Business School online, we see that there are attributes being made to entrepreneurs beyond just the fact that they are self-employed. They are curiosity, structured experimentation, adaptability, decisiveness, team building, risk tolerance. They're often very tolerant of taking risks and are comfortable with failure. Highly persistent, innovative. That's the link to creativity, and have a long-term focus of what that business plan is going to be. I'll leave it to you to decide how much of these overlap with ADHD in a positive way, that is, ADHD predisposes to these things, and how much ADHD is probably going to get in the way of some of these attributes of a successful entrepreneur. But once again, I put this out there to show you that even the definition of an entrepreneur is rather controversial, but I think among people who study this topic for a living, it goes well beyond merely being self-employed. So what does the evidence show about this connection of ADHD to entrepreneurship? Well, it's complicated. It's not as straightforward as the mainstream websites and journalists who are writing about adult ADHD or about themselves with ADHD are making this out to be. To them, you would think that this is a slam dunk, open and shut case. If you have ADHD, you are much more likely to be a successful entrepreneur. But hold your horses here a minute. It's just not that robust and straightforward. The fact that it is complicated in the journals and scientific literature tells us that there isn't a straightforward relationship here. It's going to be complex, it's going to be nuanced, if it exists at all. The factors that seem to be involved in these findings of whether or not ADHD links to entrepreneurship or indeed predicts poor success at being an entrepreneur has a lot to do with, first of all, how do you measure ADHD? If you're just using sort of a rating scale and you're measuring a certain level of symptoms beyond what is typical, you're going to get different findings than if you look at people with the clinical disorder who have much higher levels of symptoms and are being impaired by their disorder. As with creativity, what you'll see in the literature is that a few symptoms higher than typical of ADHD does seem to predispose to the desire to start a business and actually initiating starting a business, becoming an entrepreneur. It may or may not predict, however, how well that business is going to do and whether it's going to fail. But certainly entrepreneurial intentions and the initial actions to begin the business do seem to be related to somewhat elevated ADHD symptoms. It's another matter when we get to the clinical disorder, as we'll see in a moment. Also, what we see is what types of ADHD symptoms are we talking about? It's not all ADHD here. It appears that symptoms of being disinhibited or impulsive may have a somewhat positive effect on your intentions and your actions, that is starting a business as well. Hyperactivity, maybe that also helps. There's some disagreement there, but let's just admit that there might be some findings there. Inattention, on the other hand, much better relationship with showing that it either isn't likely to predict an entrepreneurship intentions or actions, or that it actually contributes to not following through and starting the business and the business failing. So inattention has an even more complicated relationship to entrepreneurial talent and accomplishment. It's clear that having more education matters. Many of the studies are done with university students, and some of them are done with people in graduate school getting an MBA at a major university. So those studies are not telling us about the broader population of ADHD individuals because most people with ADHD don't finish college. Many don't go on to graduate school. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't. Some do. About 20% or more of people with ADHD may finish college. Sometimes the findings are even less. They're even less likely to be in a graduate program, but some do, and that clearly is related to their severity of ADHD and their intelligence. But let's face it, findings on this topic that are based on college populations don't carry an awful lot of weight because they're not speaking to the broad population, the general range of ADHD out there, particularly those seen in clinics. Obviously, if you're going to be studying college populations, you're studying people of above average intelligence. So that's going to complicate the findings because it's not going to mean that we can take those findings and talk about the general population of average people with ADHD out there who have average intelligence. There is stronger evidence that having ADHD contributes to more conflict if the entrepreneurial activity involves teams, team building, and team cooperation. And that is true for both men and women. So it looks like it depends on what aspect of entrepreneurial accomplishment we're going to examine. Again, as I said, higher symptoms may predict thinking about a business, having more intentions to start one, and actually starting one. But it may also predict more conflict within the business with one's fellow uh, workers, one's employees. And lastly, let's not forget that although these studies are examining ADHD specifically, you can bet that the number of additional disorders the individual has is going to complicate this relationship even further and probably be a predictor of failure at this entrepreneurial activity. We know that 80% of children and adults have a second disorder, and at least 50% of them have a third disorder. So that's going to add even more complexity to trying to answer this question about ADHD predicting being a better entrepreneur. So what are the findings that we see to date? There does seem to be a significant but moderate relationship between higher ADHD symptoms than are typically seen and becoming self-employed. Right? Not being an entrepreneur. Now we're going back to that very limited, narrow definition of being self-employed. Several longitudinal studies indicate that by midlife, children with ADHD diagnosed in childhood, followed for 30 or more years, do have a higher rate of self-employment. And we also know from large-scale studies in Scandinavia using thousands of individuals that having a diagnosis of ADHD was a predictor of being more likely to be self-employed by mid to late life, but it was also a predictor of earning less income than other people who weren't self-employed or who didn't have ADHD, excuse me. However, being self-employed can be either a positive or negative outcome. It can be a positive outcome in that maybe it's something you sought, desired, wished for. You have that passion, that idea, or you just want to be your own boss. And it suits your ADHD beautifully because you can schedule your activities around your own lifestyle, schedule, and degree of inattention during particular times of the day. So it may be a positive thing, as some people have made it out to be. On the other hand, it could also be a negative outcome, as some of the longitudinal studies found. And that is that people with ADHD experienced more failure in entering and maintaining employment, usually with other individuals, companies, or corporations. They're more likely to quit their jobs impulsively. They're more likely to be fired from their jobs than other people. They change jobs more often, perhaps just out of boredom. All of that means that over time they're not going to rise up the corporate ladder or in their own occupation if they're working for others as quickly as other people are likely to do. And therefore they may find themselves by default having to be self-employed because the other options just aren't suitable to them or they're just not very successful when they're working in larger organizations. So I think we have to be careful here at always declaring self-employment as a desirable outcome for these individuals. It could be one or the other. We also have found in this literature that while having high ADHD symptoms may mean one is more likely to select themselves into self-employment, it also in some studies was a predictor of failure in the business and earning lower income. So again, not an open and shut slam dunk case here. The findings can be conflicting. Having higher ADHD symptoms was associated in one large-scale study with being 70% more likely to have entrepreneurial intentions. Here simply meaning one's desire to start a business. And it was twice as likely to be associated with actually starting the business. Very cool. But again, what's the problem here? You're just measuring symptoms, not clinical disorder. And these were college populations, not clinic-referred samples or the general population. Also, another large-scale study found that while these might be the case, ADHD symptoms were related to entrepreneurial intentions was mainly the impulsive hyperactive symptoms, while the degree of inattention was related to failing to follow through on the intention, and if they did start the business, a greater likelihood that the business would fail. But again, I want to emphasize the findings here are very conflicting. Some find it, some don't, some find the opposite of what others are reporting. There's no question that surveys of entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, do suggest that they may have somewhat higher symptoms of ADHD than the general population. But let's be careful here. That's not a clinical diagnosis of full disorder that leads to impairment as the term ADHD is meant to be used. So a little higher symptoms might be good here, but high enough symptoms to have a disorder might not be so good. So having a clinical diagnosis of ADHD is not directly linked to being a successful entrepreneur. But more importantly, the clinical diagnosis of ADHD may be predictive of greater conflict with others within that business and less successful team building and team effectiveness. The diagnosis in some studies was also found to be linked to a poorer sense of self-efficacy as an entrepreneur compared to entrepreneurs who didn't have ADHD. They just didn't feel that they were as successful, as effective as others. And the research showed that they showed poorer recognition of business opportunities than other people who don't have ADHD are likely to do. But again, the evidence here, the evidence base itself is very small, a little thin, and we could use some more research on that topic. There's no question that having other disorders in addition to your ADHD is quite likely to interfere with your entrepreneurial success, even though, quite frankly, it was hard to find much research that had even studied the role of comorbidity in this aspect of being an entrepreneur. And while there is a clear link between degree of ADHD and becoming self-employed, as I've already said, that is not necessarily what being an entrepreneur means as it is used within the business and the academic community. So ADHD individuals, whether have high symptoms or clinical diagnosis, might wind up by midlife being self-employed. But the reasons for that are not necessarily always positive or always negative. It's probably a mix of the two. So there is no straightforward link, as journalists would have you believe, between having ADHD, the disorder, and being more likely to be an entrepreneur and a successful entrepreneur at that. It's very clear that the process by which one becomes an entrepreneur and the pathway to doing so is being mediated by a number of other factors: intelligence, education, personality, whether you have the disorder or just a few symptoms, and so on. And all of that's going to determine whether your ADHD is a liability or a benefit. So the mainstream media articles, quite frankly, get this wrong. They oversimplify it. They imply that the link of ADHD to being an entrepreneur applies across the board, no matter what. It's a robust finding. It's a fact in the bag, and we can take it to the bank and tell people that this is a proven relationship. Well, as you see here, it's not. It's not that simple. It's not that straightforward. It's not that well established. And there's an awful lot of complexity within this research literature and the current evidence. My take on all of this was the conclusion I reached in my last commentary on creativity. I think that there's likely to be some sort of a U-shaped function here. And I believe that because, as we saw in the earlier slides, creativity probably is related to how innovative an entrepreneur you're going to be. Indeed, in some cases, like the Harvard Business School, the high curiosity and high creativity are part of what we mean by being an entrepreneur. It isn't simply being self-employed. So if you remember that U-shaped function, it looks like this. And let me just briefly explain it. If you're here, you're typical, and you have a certain probability of becoming self-employed and becoming truly an entrepreneur. As your symptoms of your disorder increase somewhat, here again, particularly disinhibition or impulsivity, and maybe hyperactivity, your likelihood of wanting to be an entrepreneur, starting a business, being successful at it, and so on, probably is increasing somewhat. But once we go past the more serious or the higher levels of ADHD symptoms, and we get into clinical symptoms of ADHD over here, then the likelihood of being an entrepreneur and a successful one at that is probably starting to go down. So it depends on where you are on this curve, on how many symptoms you have, what the nature of those symptoms happens to be, disinhibition being more important, and do you have high enough symptoms that it's impairing your life and you're over here. So again, I think it's going to be a complex relationship eventually as this all gets sorted out. But I also want to emphasize, as we often do in science, much more research is needed. So I hope once again that you found this commentary to be informative, and I hope you can understand why we simply can't take it on faith that ADHD leads to being more of an entrepreneur. That just is not the case. But there may be some small relationship there with regard to elevated symptoms of ADHD, but not necessarily the clinical diagnosis. Hey, thanks so much for joining me, and I hope you'll join me again on this channel. Please, if you like the content, please subscribe to the channel as well, and we'll see you again for another commentary or research review. Thanks so much. Be well.